All right, so the time is 12:04. Again, thank you all so much for joining today's Public Health Discovery Seminar Series titled Integrating Gender into Sexual and Reproductive Health Programming. My name is Cassie Trewick. I go by Cassie. I'm one of the admission counselors here at the Celia Scott Weatherhead School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. And today I have the honor of introducing Dr. Katherine Andrinopoulos, who is an associate professor for the International Health and Sustainable Development Department, as well as the program director for HD programs. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A chat. And at the end of our seminar series, we will do a Q&A section. But I'm going to let Dr. Katherine Andrinopoulos take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Cassie. And I'm so excited to speak with you all today. I am not fantastic at managing Q&A and chat while I present. So as Cassie mentioned, we will please, like as you're seeing the work, please feel free to enter your questions through those functions in Zoom. And then when we get to the end, we'll make sure to get through them. Unless, of course, you can't hear me or the slides cut out or some technical difficulty, and then flag me down. Before I get into some of the nitty-gritty of the projects that I want to share with you today, I wanted to kind of position myself within the work. I think this is important for all of the kinds of work we do in public health, but especially when we're talking about constructs like gender, social constructs that are important to the lives of the people we are trying to improve in public health, and also having a big impact on our own lives and how we kind of engage with populations, how we think about research questions, the lens that we bring to our work. And so a little bit of background, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, which is what motivated me to pursue more education in public health and work in this field. I was in Peace Corps in the Dominican Republic and lived abroad for a number of years. But even though I've had that experience, it's not the same experience as many of the populations that I'm trying to kind of work with in low and middle income countries, as I myself haven't lived for an extensive amount of time, nor experienced some of the constraints, economic and other constraints in LMICs. After Peace Corps, I went to Hopkins and also had previous degree from UNC, and just wanting to acknowledge that these are PWI institutions in a high income country. And so this is the place where I got my training and needing to kind of reflect on that in my own work currently. After that, I had Fulbright funding and some other sources of funding to do my dissertation work, which was to help prison correctional centers in Jamaica to introduce HIV testing and treatment into their health programming. And so have experience working in incarceration. And what that highlights in terms of my background is also a social justice lens that I bring to all of the work that I do. And also just noting that the work I'm going to share with you today and all of my previous work outside of the work in Jamaica has been funded through USAID, which is the US government. So important to consider that. And I'm trying to introduce a little humor in here, but this is a picture of me back in 2016 in my Halloween costume before the election happened. And so that was me dressed up with the co-teacher as Hillary and Trump. It is less funny to look at that now, but also just kind of bringing my more kind of liberal ideals. That's important for me to reflect on in my work. Thinking of gender, the way it impacts my life is that I'm a first generation. My parents were born in Greece. I was born in the US, but bringing some of those kind of cultural patriarchal ideals to my own experience of gender, and that the way it kind of really impacts my life currently is through kind of being a caretaker, both for aging parents and for, as you see it here, my two young children and my spouse. And so that is a major way in which gender impacts my life. However, thinking about how gender impacts the lives of some of the populations we've worked with in terms of health, it hasn't ever prevented me from getting access to healthcare or family planning, as you'll see is one of our projects, or really any kind of power that I've had to reach some of the goals that I have. So my experience of gender is different than some of the populations that I've worked with. So what is gender? This talk is about integrating gender into public health work. And so I think it's important to ground what we mean by this social construct. And the definitions of gender that have informed the work I'm going to present to you is the economic, social, political, and cultural attributes the constraints and opportunities associated with being male or female in a society. Gender also includes the roles, behaviors, activities, rights, and responsibilities that a society considers appropriate for women, men, girls, and boys. So this is one important definition of gender, but it doesn't highlight some of the elements that are important in terms of thinking of gender in a non-binary way. And so I also complement that definition with another, which defines gender as the attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that a given culture associates with a person's biological sex. So gender is a social construct and it can vary across culture, time, and space. And so what we mean by gender is going to depend on where we are, who we are, when we are. So gender has informed almost all of the research that I've worked on in public health. I'm going to highlight 3 projects that I think exemplify very different ways in which you can integrate gender into your work. The first that I'm going to talk about is the most recent, which is where we developed a tool and then also assessed ways of using the tool and an e-learning course and training of family planning providers in something that's called gender competency. So how we've increased or are working to increase the gender competency of family planning providers. That's one way in which gender has influenced my work. The second project that I will briefly talk about is one where we were looking at designing tools that would help people measure sexual orientation and gender identity in health programming, specifically in HIV programs. And so I'll talk about this resource that we developed to help us understand on a global level, how can we measure sexual orientation and gender? And then finally, the third thing that I'll just touch on, and I'll just touch on each of these briefly, is some formative work we did to help develop HIV programming in the Dominican Republic in thinking about how gender influences key populations in this specific context, Haitian female sex workers. And so the kind of representation that this project has in my work is looking at intersectionality, which means looking at multiple forms of a person's identity, gender being one dimension, but that it's important to consider multiple dimensions of someone's identity. And so we'll start in with the gender competency work and this tool that we developed for family planning providers. So gender competency, I've defined gender for you, but what we mean by competency is that we expect or we hope that family planning providers will have knowledge, attitudes, and skills that can help them reduce the gender-related barriers for their clients, right? So competency means they have these skills, they have these attitudes, and the gender-related barriers that they may face include clients who might have differential power than their partner in terms of making decisions about family planning, different levels of knowledge about it, understanding the different types of laws that might impact whether or not you can provide different forms of family planning, and being able to recognize things like gender-based violence. So these are just a few examples of some of the complexity that family planning providers face in trying to address a specific health issue, but that are kind of based in gender. And so the goal is that with increased gender competency, providers will be more responsive to the diverse needs of their clients and be able to deliver high quality family planning services. And so a couple of years ago, the United States Agency for International Development, through the Data for Impact project, asked us to work on this project that builds on a gender competency framework that outlined dimensions of gender competency. So there had already been some formative work done by the Human Resources for Health 2030 project to define what is gender competency in relation to family planning, what areas does our workforce need to be competent in order to be gender competent. And so they did work in Ethiopia and in the Philippines and with some expert review meetings to define 6 domains of gender competency, which include gender sensitive communication, promoting individual agency, supporting legal rights and status related to family planning, being able to engage men and boys as both partners and users in family planning, facilitating positive couples communication and cooperative decision-making, and addressing gender-based violence. That we would want family planning providers who can work across all of these domains to increase their gender competency. And so the previous team had worked with USAID to define what we mean by gender competency, and also developed an e-learning course, what you see in the middle here, that providers can take. It's free and publicly available. And it goes over attitudes, knowledge, skills in each of the domains that I just mentioned. They came to us in wanting to develop a tool that providers could use to assess their level of gender competency. So can we measure whether or not family planning providers have competency in each of these domains? And then together, having a tool for measuring gender competency plus the e-learning course would lead to providers that have strengthened skills in these areas. So we went through several levels of tool development. For the tool, the first phase was to design the tool, and we did this through cognitive interviews with providers in Ghana and in Uganda. And these are just an example of where in Ghana we worked with family planning providers and where in Uganda we worked. And we took care to include both urban and peri-urban areas and to include places where they want to have a higher uptake of family planning services. So we were strategic in where we went and who we talked to in terms of providers in each area. And through doing some work with providers in each area, we developed this tool, which includes a module for each of the 6 domains of gender competency that I just mentioned. And it includes 3 components. So we designed this as a tool for self-learning, not for necessarily accountability, right? So it's not about getting a certain grade. It's about being able to reflect on where you might need additional training using the e-learning course. And so the tool includes a statement and response section for each of the modules, an answer key that explains why one answer might be more gender competent than another, and then a discussion guide so that the providers can use their assessment with others they're working with and talk about how each of these domains influences their work and what they might be able to do about it. And so just to give you an example of what this looks like, it's in a paper-based form, also publicly available, where providers can do a self-assessment answering each of the items and then marking their responses on this section, and then moving to the answer key where they would assign a point value for each of their responses. And then finally, totaling their responses in a guide in terms of noting whether they have high, medium, or low levels of gender competency. Again, monitoring and evaluation for learning. So the key points that we wanted to do is that we wanted them to understand why they might have gotten a question more or less points for a certain response, and that they would have the ability to talk about this with others with whom they work. So after developing the tool, we worked with providers to apply the tool. So how would this work in a real world setting? We did a workshop with 14 providers in Accra, Ghana, to use the tool and to give us feedback on it. And I can't go into too much detail on what we found in each of these phases, but as one example, I will show you that one of the dimensions that they thought was most critically important for their work was the engaging men and boys as partners and users. And this was a consistent theme, especially when we worked in Ghana, that this dimension was one that they felt that they wanted more support in, and that was one of the more challenging areas for their work. And so you can see here, we collected information from people using the tool, both qualitatively. So we have some feedback here on how it can be difficult to engage men and boys because there aren't many methods that can be directly used by them. And then their feedback on where and how we might engage men and boys as partners and users, which came from the discussion kind of component of the tool. And we also collected basic things like how long it took to complete, what the score was, and then what levels of gender competency were using the tool. And the takeaway here is that it is not terribly long to complete each module. So it's designed that you could do each module on their own or modules all together, and that there was variation across the modules, which showed that this could be a tool that could be used to measure differences, right? You need to see some variation. And then the final kind of leg of this work, which we just wrapped up this year, was to look at the ways that now that we have this tool and this e-learning course, how can this practically be applied to increase family planning providers' gender competency. So we were able to get feedback and to use these instruments, these resources, because we had funding from a special project through USAID. But what happens to these resources in the real world where they're publicly available, but we need groups to have interest, to know how to use these different resources, and especially governments, right? So ministries of health, how could these resources be useful to them as they're rolling out training to providers. And so that really, Kathy mentioned I'm in the Department of International Health and Sustainability, but the really key part of sustainability is, can a government in a low and middle income country use the things that you're creating? Is it useful to them in a real world setting? And so we worked with the Ghana Health Services, which is the Ministry of Health in Ghana, to look at ways in which we could incorporate use of the tool and the e-learning course in their training for family planning providers. And we assessed 3 different models that they could use for these resources. The first is your traditional in-person workshop, where we had providers come together in a centralized location. We provided them with tablets. We provided across all of these modalities, the providers with data that they would need to be able to access the tool and the e-learning course. And we held a traditional workshop where there was face-to-face communication and synchronous, so meaning same time learning among providers. Then we also held a different training where we used a blended model where people came together in person to a central location. They were onboarded in terms of how to access the e-learning course and the tool. They practiced doing that together in the same environment, and then they were sent home to use these resources asynchronously at a time that was convenient for during a week kind of break. And then they came back together after that week so that there was the ability to talk in person about the different kind of aspects of gender competency. And then finally, the last one that we looked at was completely virtual. And so we had a 1-hour Zoom meeting with providers. We showed them the resources and how to access them, and gave them instructions, gave them data, and then came back, sent them on their own to complete the work for a week, and then met again through another Zoom meeting. Throughout the blended and virtual training modalities, we were also in connection with people via email, but even more importantly, via WhatsApp group. So constant communication and reminders to complete the different resources. And just to give you an example of where we worked, so the in-person was in the northern region of Ghana, the blended was in the Ashanti region of Ghana, and then the virtual gave us the increased ability to reach providers from all 16 health regions of Ghana to be able to participate. We gathered information about, how these different training modalities worked using quantitative and qualitative techniques. And I'll just share a few of the things that we found. First of all, using the tool, we did see an increase in self-assessment scores for people who completed the online course. So uniformly across the training modalities, whether it was in-person, blended, or virtual, and across all of the domains, except for the legal rights and status, we saw a statistically significant increase in their self-assessment score for the people who completed the online course. When you saw that map that I presented, I think one of our gut reactions is to think, well, if it's completely virtual, then that totally increases access. You can be anywhere and be able to have access to these resources like this online course. And what we found was slightly different from that. In-person and blended modalities led to all providers who participated in those ways completing the e-learning course. But for the virtual modality, only 65% of providers who were in that modality completed the e-learning course. And part of what they described was really a lot of challenges with internet connectivity. And so whereas we thought, well, if it's totally virtual, no one has to move around, they can access it whenever they want. That really depends on whether or not they have access to internet network. And in fact, many of the providers suggested that they moved from one community to another, or they ended up staying at work or went to certain locations because they could access better internet there. And so the idea that virtual leads to, not having to travel was really not borne out in what we saw happening. So only 65% of providers completed it in the virtual modality. And so this led to us kind of learning about how these gender competency resources can be used in different ways. And the take home is that there's not a one size fits all, but we need to consider the needs of our clients, in this case, providers, in terms of whether or not they have high or low connectivity. So we made this kind of table for people planning to do trainings to consider. Will your providers have high connectivity? Will they have low connectivity? And then do they prefer online or in-person learning? So some of our providers mentioned, well, I really love the in-person format. I like doing trainings online. This is something that I'm used to. We should all be doing this. Whereas other people said, listen, I was born before computers. This is really challenging for me. So if you aren't considering the preference for online learning, and then also that another aspect, which is the actual digital literacy. So are people able to navigate when there are challenges with connecting, or as an example, some people experience challenges with pop-up blockers, which we had an IT person to help kind of mitigate. But what is the level of digital literacy that you might have among your providers, and that should really guide how you use these different gender resources to train your family planning providers. Okay, on to the second project, looking at sexual orientation and gender identity measures for global survey research. So what informed this work that I'm about to describe is my kind of working in the field of HIV for, at this point, when the opportunity to do this work, for about a little over 10 years. I've been working kind of in the field of HIV, looking at how we can adapt programming, but also acutely aware of that with the high level of funding for HIV, there is also a really high level of accountability. And so monitoring and evaluation programs in the field of HIV are under a lot of pressure to be able to talk about reach of their program and explain kind of whether or not certain populations that we know are highly vulnerable to HIV, our key populations, are being reached by that. But within this field, as we collect data, we are also constructing ideas about personal identities, including those related to gender, right? So when you give a survey to someone, the demographic boxes that they're asked to fill out reinforces this concept that those are the appropriate boxes that there are to fit into. And so, you know, whereas like as public health programs, part of our job is to collect data to understand who we're reaching, how our programs work. We also need to be really sensitive to the fact that how we construct capturing this information is a way of shaping social norms and ideas related to gender identity. And so this quote really brings it home, I think, what I'm trying to say here, which is that knowledge construction is a cyclical process, and beliefs about the world shape how surveys are designed and data are collected. Then survey research findings in turn shape beliefs about the world, and the cycle repeats. And so the point at which we began doing this work, where we're looking at measuring sexual orientation and gender identity, was when there had been a real transformation in the field of HIV and understanding that we had not been appropriately capturing the experiences of transgender populations, but had been focusing on men who have sex with men as a key population and designing programs for them. And that we needed to have more information, more visibility, which means actually survey questions, demographic questions that allow us to understand transgender population experiences as well. And so this came about where when USAID and others were promoting gender and sexual diversity trainings globally, and that there was a real acceptance of the understanding of differences between sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, I would need a whole class period to go over what the genderbread person here represents, but for the sake of this presentation, I will just note that it reinforces what we understand now about separating out sexual orientation and gender identity as correlated but different kind of aspects of a person's identity, and the need to kind of measure and understand these differently. At the time that we did this work, PEPFAR, the program that funds most of the HIV work globally, required programs receiving funding to submit information about the clients that they had served. And the Monitoring and Evaluation Reference 2.0 guide, these are the questions that they would need to be able to respond to. And so they had developed some questions that were trying to get at differentiating gender identity and sexual orientation, but in a way that may not be completely accurate or applicable in all kind of global context. And so I'll just point out some of the things here that were a little off in how this might be useful in capturing this information around gender identity here. It inaccurately is asking whether someone was born a boy or born a girl versus being assigned a sex at birth, which could be fixed in this way. It used terms like transgender male to female or transgender female to male, which are not identity kind of terminology that is used by people that might be from trans populations. And it only was measuring sexual behavior rather than other aspects of sexual orientation that can be important, which include attraction or how someone self-identifies, which may or may not be the same as the behavior that they report, especially people who are in adolescence and may not be sexually active yet. So these are some of the challenges that we were looking at, the way in which this might not be the most appropriate way to be measuring sexual orientation and gender identity. And whereas the previous project that I mentioned was really using a binary concept of gender as for cisgender men and cisgender women and thinking about family planning, at least in the field of HIV, it's a little bit more expansive. And so that we're more appropriately using concepts related to gender that are more along a continuum, that are not necessarily in one binary, male, female kind of documentation. And so as part of the work where we were trying to develop ideas around sexual orientation and gender identity that might be useful to teams capturing this kind of information, is that everyone has a gender identity. And so you'll see here under this gender umbrella, the first raindrop that we have is cisgender. And so whether you are transgender or cisgender, it was like one way to start understanding gender identity. Cisgender would mean that the sex that you identify with is also the sex that you were assigned at birth. So everybody has a gender. It's not that men have a gender or women have a gender or only trans people have genders. Everyone has a gender, and it's about understanding where we fall within that. And so we use this to kind of also give examples of that the culture that you're in might have very different terminology and different ideas of different genders. So travesti or transvestite has a different meaning in Western in certain contexts where it relates to physical transformation for your gender, outward gender expression to match your gender identity, or it just might be used as an overall broad term for a trans person in Latin American context, for example. So understanding the terminology needs to be culturally appropriate is the point here. And the other aspect is that when we're doing public health work, especially global public health work, we need to be careful not to be exporting our own cultural ideas. And so this concept of gender as being beyond binary gender is not new to many of the low and middle income countries that we might work in public health. In fact, it was during the process of colonization where many began to adopt binary concepts of gender. And so I just use this here as an indigenous art form that is noting a double soul, which in Latin America is one kind of symbol of being a gender beyond a binary gender, which is kind of an exported concept. And so we could be exporting concepts in how we have design survey instruments and exporting concepts by not attending to like indigenous ideas around gender. And then finally, that as we're developing things like survey items that might ask you to report on your gender identity or sexual orientation and other aspects of identity, it should be done in concert with the people who you are trying to measure in some way, right? And so integrating them in the process of creating survey items would be a better approach rather than just thinking about what data do we need and kind of making our questions that way. Having better questions can give us more valid data. How someone actually identifies is important rather than how we might identify them from our concepts. And it also creates a welcoming environment for clients in cultural competency. So it's not just about getting the right data, but it's about the tone that you send when you're delivering health services by getting it right in terms of how someone might identify and demonstrating a space for them in your health services. And so one of the things, we did multiple aspects of this work where we were looking at getting better measures of sexual orientation and gender identity globally. One of the things we did was write a primer, a guide onto how you in your context or the program in their context might be able to design these questions. So we had this 4-step process, which had included building an understanding of sexual orientation and gender identity locally. So looking at local research and sexual and gender studies about, what terms are used, what categories are used, reviewing existing questions that are being used within the country that you might be working, conducting qualitative research to develop SOGI measures, and then to pilot and evaluate whether or not these SOGI measures are performed the way that you would want them to. For the sake of brevity, I will only talk a little bit about what we recommended for this third aspect in terms of using qualitative research to develop measures of sexual orientation and gender identity. We know that qualitative work can help us understand the why or the how, but there's also a specific component of qualitative research called folk taxonomy that is a field of study that helps us understand how a culture names certain things, how it identifies things, how it creates boundaries around cultural identities, and how it classifies groups. And within folk taxonomies, you can use different approaches, including open-ended elicitation techniques like in-depth interviews to understand boundaries that are appropriate, describe characteristics as to why someone might go in one category versus another, and identify culturally appropriate terminology. So in this guidance document that we wrote, we included examples of in-depth interview questions that you could use when trying to develop these boundaries and the different identities that might go into each one of them. And also different techniques like free lists that can be used to generate all of the different appropriate terminology and respectful terminology that might be used for a population to identify. And then using things like pile sorts to create categories, right? So moving from longer lists of different types of people, then grouping people based on certain characteristics. And this is all driven by doing work with populations that you are trying to measure rather than thinking of what these categories might be in your kind of office at a university setting. Okay, so that was the second way in which the public health programs that I've worked in has used gender. The third way that I wanted to talk about is how we have looked at using the concept of gender in understanding more about key populations and being attentive to the concept of intersectionality, which is that we each have multiple aspects to our identity, including gender as being one of them. And so for all programs in public health, all PEPFAR funded programs in public health, which focuses on HIV programming again, it is required that they conduct something called a gender analysis, which is an assessment of the social, cultural, gender norms, inequities, and inequalities that puts people at risk for acquiring or transmitting HIV and their ability to access services. So as different countries are designing programs, they first need to be informed by a gender analysis. And so within that, you would be tasked with understanding who has control over resources based on gender norms, who has access to and utilization of HIV prevention and treatment, what are the differences in power. And here, this is where they brought our team on in understanding differences in power for women, men, girls, and boys, but also gender and sexual minorities, as well as subgroups of these populations. And so trying to break out of the concept that gender and gender analyses should only be conducted to look at differences between men and women, moving beyond that to understand how it impacts other key populations. And so within HIV, the key populations include men who have sex with men, transgender people, sex workers, and people who use injection drugs, but gender analyses had not systematically included them. And so they wanted to understand better how and why might we include a gender analysis? What might it look like if key populations are integrated into conducting gender analyses that inform HIV programming? And so when we began this work, the key population programs that we talked to would say, well, we don't do gender analyses. It's just too complicated and too theoretical. We use a human rights lens to understand and to frame all of the work that we do, which can be important. But here you have a tension where PEPFAR programming is requiring something. And if you aren't a part of that, then you might miss out in terms of having funding for your program or being accurately represented in them. So we gave an example. We conducted two small studies that used a gender lens, conducted gender analyses, but looking at key populations specifically. I have a colleague, Dr. Mai Do, who was looking at women who use injection drugs in Vietnam. And I did a small study in the Dominican Republic looking at Haitian female sex workers and how their needs are different than other sex workers in the Dominican Republic in terms of HIV programming. And so again, that intersectional perspective being brought into the work, injection drug use in women, sex workers and being Haitian. So your racial or ethnic identity is something that's also important to consider, which was critically important in the Dominican Republic, where there's been some changes recently to the Constitution, such that if you don't have documentation, you could be second or third generation born in the Dominican Republic, but still be considered a Haitian migrant and left out of the education and health systems in certain ways. And so we looked even more heterogeneously within the population of Haitian sex workers to understand those who were Haitian migrants who may not speak Spanish, those who identified as Dominican, and those who identified as Rayana, which means they speak Spanish and were born in the DR but might have Haitian ancestry, and looking at different needs that they might have in terms of HIV programming. And so we did some qualitative work, in-depth interviews with Haitian female sex workers, giving attention to these different types of populations that I just mentioned before, and looking at people who were working both in Santo Domingo and in Puerto Plata, which are like a tourist town in the capital city, and conducting conducting sex work. I wish I could go into all of the really important and interesting findings from this study, but the one that I'll highlight, because I think it demonstrates the intersectional component and how that's important to consider with gender, is that one of the strongest kind of themes that came out was the importance of motherhood in relation to their perception of themselves as caretakers, and is something that, whereas they may have experienced a lot of discrimination as Haitians, that they felt a lot of pride in themselves as mothers, and mothers who are Haitian. And so I have an example of one quote we have here, where a woman is explaining to us why sex work is the outlet she has for financial resources, and why she does it primarily in her role as a mother to take care of her children. And in fact, most sex workers globally are also mothers, which is oftentimes left out of our understanding of sex workers. And among women who are HIV positive, which was a smaller subset within our sample, their motivation to stay healthy and to take their medication was oftentimes because of their desire to take care of their children, and knowing that if they weren't alive to do that, there would not be someone else there too. So again, their role as caretakers, which is a gender-related kind of aspect of their identity for children, their roles as mothers being important to us, thinking about how can we provide HIV services? So if this part of your identity is important to you, then that would be something important to integrate in the delivery of HIV services. And so one of the main implications, or one of the main recommendations we had for PEPFAR programs in the Dominican Republic, is that that this identity as a mother is incredibly important for Haitian sex workers, and that we should look at integrating that role into how HIV programming is delivered. And if you could couple programming that would help them reach their goals as parents and as mothers, then they may also, with HIV services, and these might be things that might be, there might be greater uptake of among the population. So in conclusion, and I have been timing myself so that we have room for questions and hopefully I'll have some answers. Gender is a social construct, and it is inherently complex. It's dynamic. It's defined by where you are, when you are. There are a lot of complex aspects to it. But at the same time, it can be used in very practical ways in applied public health programs. And I hope that I've demonstrated that to you by showing the example of, one, tools and resources to train people on how to be gender competent. Two, how to design public health measures and surveys that pay attention and are correctly designed to measure gender identity. And three, looking at gender and intersectionality in how we design public health programs and inform the design of programs. And so, yes, it is very complex, but it can also be very practical. And that I see our roles, my role as a researcher, but our role as public health practitioners, especially for those of us like me who work in academia, is to be a link between some of the theoretical components of constructs like gender and the applied discipline of public health. And so what that's termed as praxis, being able to take something that's complex but influences our lives every day and see how we can make public health programming better by bringing that into our work. And so, so that's my take home. And I hope this has given you an idea of the kind of work that I do here as a public health researcher, at Tulane, and how to integrate gender into sexual and reproductive health programs. And now we can open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrinopoulos. And so we do have one question in the Q&A. The first one was a community-based participatory research model used in this research?
So, well, which one? So I will say there were 3 different types of research. I don't know if you want to like write more in there for whoever submitted that question. But the principles of community-based participatory research informed each of these approaches, right? So for the gender competency work, taking time to work with providers in different countries and different settings. Part of what I didn't share though, there is the nuances of the cognitive interviews that we went through with providers, where we asked them questions and then we asked them like to repeat the question back in their own words. So, really coming from like, how do you understand this concept? What are we missing from it? So that construct validity of like, okay, we're trying to measure this dimension, but is there something that we've missed? So from that perspective, involving the community, which in this case is providers, was important. For the second piece, absolutely. The SOGI measurement, I think involving people of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities is important in all of the work you do. What I didn't mention is that we did also an online training for researchers looking to work in this space and giving examples of how you might integrate people from each of those different populations. So for an example, we had interviewers who represented different gender identities to help us gather data, but actually they played a major role in how we designed our questions in a previous survey, which then led to ideas for the SOGI measurement. And there was also work from a local community partner in Nicaragua that we used to help inform development of that guidance document. And in the third one, we worked with community-based organizations that were providing services to Haitians and to Haitian sex workers, some of whom also identified as Haitian sex workers. And they participated, they did help with recruitment, but that's not where their participation should end. They helped us conceptualize the work, and they also helped us interpret and disseminate the work. So when we had meetings about what we'd found locally in country, they were always part of that and participating in and whether or not our take-home messages were really what should be represented in our reports.
All right. Please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A chat if you have any questions.
Is anyone, I know sometimes you can be shy to like put a question in, but I'm looking at some of the participants here. Does any of this work align with work that you're doing? It's always great to have a community of practice within Tulane as well. Like, does some of the work presented align with work you're doing? If you wanted to like put that in a question, or it's more of a comment, but you can use a question function. And have you grappled ever with using social constructs like gender in your work?
Well, if there aren't any questions, thank you all for joining today's Public Health Discovery Seminar Series. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrinopoulos, for presenting your seminar today. If you have any questions that you are like, I want to ask Dr. Andrinopoulos separate from the seminar series, if you can drop your email in the chat, Dr. Andrinopoulos, for some students.
Sure.
But again, thank you all so much for joining today seminar series. If you want to share this seminar, it will be uploaded to our YouTube playlist. So please definitely share that. And Dr. Andrinopoulos did drop her email in the chat. I'm gonna try to put our email in the chat as well, the SPHTM email as well if you have any questions about our programs that we offer here. But again, thank you all so much. I'm going to give you back 10 minutes of your time today. You all have a wonderful Wednesday and a wonderful week, and bye.